shut with a dull thud, and Leroy Griffith exhaled loudly as he descended the peeling steps of the porch. His heavy work boots clattered loudly on the concrete. The evening air was heavy and humid, as it often was in July in southern Detroit. The clock read exactly 7:30 p.m., a time when most of his neighbors were already home, locked away from the troubled reality of the East Side. "Damn cigarettes," Leroy muttered under his breath, patting the pockets of his worn jeans in search of a crumpled pack. They always run out at the worst possible moment. At 49, Leroy looked older. His once strong body had grown heavy, and deep wrinkles lined his dark face, traces of the 15 years he had spent in state prison for armed robbery. 3 years ago, he was released with the firm intention of starting a new life, but the past clung to him like burrs to his clothes. Leroy's argument with Tamika was particularly heated. His wife threw the electricity bill at him, screaming that they were about to have their power cut off. When he tried to explain that the delay in his paycheck from the auto shop was temporary, she hurled the worst accusation at him. "Laquan was right about you," Tamika shouted, her eyes glistening with tears. "He said you'd never change. An ex-con will always be an ex-con." The mention of Laquan Desmond's name made Leroy's blood boil. That smug bastard had half the neighborhood in his pocket, lending money at extortionate rates and dealing in anything that would bring a profit, from drugs to stolen goods, and now it looked like he had extended his dirty tentacles to his wife. "I'm going out for cigarettes," Leroy said, slamming the door behind him. He needed some fresh air to calm down. Maybe he'd knock back a couple of shots at Freddy's bar on the corner of Mack Avenue. Leroy had no idea that this routine trip for cigarettes would completely turn his life upside down in the next 3 hours. Detective Ezekiel Brooks was just about to leave for home when his radio crackled with an urgent call. Friday evening promised to be quiet, but quiet evenings were rare in the Detroit Police Department's Homicide Division. "Brooks, we have a murder on Concord Street, house number 42. You're going there." The dispatcher's voice sounded mundane, as if he were talking about a pizza order rather than someone's life being cut short. 38-year-old Brooks sighed as he picked up the keys to his patrol car from his desk. Concord Street was in the neighborhood where he had grown up before a scholarship, and sheer determination had allowed him to escape. He knew those streets like the lines on his own palm and the scars they left on people's lives. Brooks arrived at the scene at the same time as the crime scene investigators. Laquan Desmond's small one-story house was already cordoned off with yellow police tape, and curious neighbors had gathered on the street despite the late hour. "What do we have here?" Brooks asked the patrol officer, taking notes at the entrance. "The victim is a black male, approximately 40-45 years old, multiple stab wounds, found by a neighbor around 9:01 p.m., the young cop reported. "And something else interesting. We've already received a statement from a Tamika Griffith. She claims that her husband Leroy Griffith committed the murder." Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Did she see him do it?" "No, sir. She says her husband left the house around 7:30 p.m. to get cigarettes after an argument in which the victim was mentioned. At around 9 p.m., a neighbor called her and said she saw Leroy leaving Desmond's house and then discovered the body." "Where is the complainant now?" "In a patrol car waiting for you." Brooks nodded and headed for the police car parked across the street. In the back seat, he saw a middle-aged woman with a tired face and her hands clasped nervously. "Mrs. Griffith, I'm Detective Ezekiel Brooks investigating the murder of Mr. Desmond." He sat down next to her, leaving the car door open. "Tell me why you think your husband was involved in this crime." Tamika Griffith looked up at him with reddened eyes because Leroy threatened him many times. "We owed Laquan almost $3,000. $1 million. We borrowed the money when Leroy lost his last job." She paused as if gathering her thoughts. "We had a terrible fight today. I told him that Laquan wanted the money back and was threatening to take the car. Leroy was furious. He's always like that when it comes to Laquan. It's an old score from when they were teenagers." Tamika nervously smoothed a stray strand of hair. Leroy said he'd deal with that shit once and for all. Then he left, supposedly to get cigarettes. That was at 7:30. An hour and a half later, Shanquita called me and said she saw Leroy coming out of Laquan's house. She lives right across the street and saw everything from her window. And then she went to Laquan's to ask for some sugar and found him. Brooks made notes in his notebook, noting the intonations and pauses in the woman's speech. Over the years, he had learned to hear not only what people said, but also what they didn't say. "Mrs. Griffith, where is your husband now?" "I don't know. He hasn't come home." The detective nodded. "Have you tried to contact him?" "His phone is off." Tamika lowered her head. "Detective, Leroy is a good man, but he has a difficult past, and when he gets angry, he becomes a different person." "We'll find him and get to the bottom of this," Brooks assured the woman. "Right now, I need you to go to the station and give a detailed statement." Leaving Tamika with another officer, Brooks headed for the victim's house. Inside, forensic experts were working, photographing and collecting evidence. The body of Laquan Desmond lay in the living room in a pool of almost dried blood. The medical examiner was already making his preliminary report. "What do you think, Doc?" Brooks asked, pulling on latex gloves. "At least 6 stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. One went straight through the heart. Death was almost instantaneous." The expert pointed to a bloody kitchen knife lying in a clear evidence bag. "The murder weapon, most likely. No fingerprints, but there may be DNA traces on the handle. Time of death is approximately between 8 o'clock and 8:30 p.m. Brooks looked around. The modest furnishings of the home contrasted with the gold chains around the victim's neck and the expensive watch on his wrist. A classic image of a petty local big shot living off the poverty of his neighbors. "No signs of forced entry," one of the forensic experts noted. "The victim probably knew his killer and led him into the house voluntarily." "Is anything missing?" Brooks asked. "It's hard to say without an inventory, but at first glance, nothing of value. The watch, ring, money in the wallet, everything's here. Looks like a crime of personal animosity, not a robbery." Brooks nodded and stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. A tall, thin woman with a nervous, twitchy face approached him on the street. "Detective, I'm Shanquita Holloway. I found the body and called 911. Brooks introduced himself and began questioning the witness. "Mrs. Holloway, you told Tamika Griffith that you saw her husband leaving the victim's house tonight." Shanquita nodded quickly, her long, false nails tapping against each other nervously. "Yes, it was definitely him. I was sitting by the window watching my show when I saw Leroy rush out of Laquan's house. It was around 8:30. He looked around like he didn't want to be seen. Then he quickly walked toward Mack Avenue." "Are you sure it was Leroy Griffith?" "Absolutely. I've known him for over 10 years. We're neighbors. It was him, 100%. Same height, same walk, same Detroit Lions cap he always wears." "Why did you go to Mr. Desmond's house later?" "I needed sugar for a pie." Shanquita shrugged. Laquan always helped his neighbors out with little things. "I knocked, but no one answered. The door was ajar, so I looked inside and called out to him. And then I saw—" Her voice faltered. Everything was covered in blood. Brooks took her statement and asked Shanquita to be available for further questions. He was already mentally forming a plan of action. He had to find Leroy Griffith as soon as possible. Back at the station, the detective launched a search. A photo of Leroy from the database was sent to all patrol officers. Brooks also requested access to surveillance cameras in the area and began checking local bars and diners, typical haunts for someone trying to hide from trouble. At 11:30 p.m., a message came in from the patrol officers. Leroy Griffith had been spotted at the Blue Flamingo Bar, 3 blocks from the crime scene. Brooks immediately drove there. The Blue Flamingo was a typical neighborhood bar with cheap beer and pool tables covered with worn felt. When Brooks entered, accompanied by 2 patrol officers, the patrons fell silent, creating a tense silence familiar to the detective. Leroy was sitting in the far corner with a half-empty beer bottle in front of him. He didn't even try to run when he saw the cops. He just looked at them wearily and took a swig from the bottle. Leroy Griffith. Brooks approached the table, showing his badge. "I'm Detective Ezekiel Brooks. I need you to come with me to the station to make a statement about the murder of Laquan Desmond." Leroy's face showed genuine surprise. "Laquan's dead? Killed?" "Don't play dumb, Griffith," one of the patrolmen interjected. "Your wife already told us everything." Leroy slowly put down the bottle. "Tamika, what did she tell you?" "About your argument, about your threats against Desmond, about your sudden disappearance after it," Brooks listed. "We also have a witness who saw you leaving the victim's house around the time of the murder." Leroy's face froze. "This is some kind of mistake, Detective. Yes, Tamika and I had a fight, and yes, I lost my temper and left. But I wasn't at Laquan's, I swear to you. I left the house and went straight to Freddy's bar, stayed there until closing time, then came here." "We'll check your alibi," Brooks said calmly. "In the meantime, you'll have to come with us. You can do this voluntarily, or we'll put you in handcuffs. It's your choice." Leroy sighed heavily. "I didn't do anything, Detective. I swear, but I'll go with you voluntarily." As they left the bar, Brooks noticed that Leroy's hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger. The man was clearly shocked by the accusations, but something told the detective that there was more to the story than met the eye. In the police car, Leroy sat silently, staring out the window at the night streets of Detroit rushing by. His face was impenetrable, but his eyes betrayed the anxiety of a man who knew all too well how the system could crush an innocent man, especially one with a criminal record. "This is all some kind of misunderstanding," he finally said quietly. "I didn't kill Laquan. Yes, we weren't on the best of terms. Yes, I owed him money, but kill him? Why would I risk everything I've built since I got out of prison?" Brooks didn't answer. He knew that the real conversation would only begin in the interrogation room, and he had a feeling that this was going to be a very long night. The interrogation room at the Detroit police station greeted Leroy Griffith with cold gray walls and a metal table bolted to the floor. It was a place he hoped never to see again after his release. Detective Ezekiel Brooks sat across from him, leafing through papers in a thin folder. The clock on the wall showed that it was the beginning of the night. "Mr. Griffith," Brooks began, turning on the tape recorder, "tell me where you were today between 7:30 and 8:30. Leroy ran his hand over his face, fatigue mixed with irritation. "I already told you. After the argument with Tamika, I left the house at around 8 o'clock and went to Freddy's bar on Mack Avenue. I sat there until about 10:30, had a few beers. Then I went to the Blue Flamingo and stayed there until you found me." "And you can prove that?" "The bartenders at both places know me. Courtney works at Freddy's. She can confirm it. I'm a regular there." Leroy leaned forward. "Listen, Detective, I understand how this looks. An ex-con, problems with a creditor, suddenly leaving home. But I'm not an idiot. I've spent 15 years in prison. I'm not going back there." Brooks made a note in his notebook. "Nevertheless, we have a witness who saw you leaving the victim's house at around 11:30 p.m. That witness is mistaken." Leroy shook his head. "Who is this person?" "Shanquita Holloway, your neighbor." Leroy snorted. "Shanquita? Seriously? You're building a case on her word? That woman has hated me ever since I refused to fix her car on credit. She fundamentally misunderstands everything about me." "Why did you refuse to help her?" Brooks asked. "Because she owes half the neighborhood and never pays her debts, and I can't afford to work for free. Shanquita has it in for me, Detective. She's tried to turn Tamika against me more times than I can count." Brooks nodded, pretending to write it down as an insignificant detail. But the information caught his professional attention. "Let's talk about your history with Laquan Desmond. Your wife mentioned that you had a long-standing feud." Leroy leaned back in his chair, his face darkening. We grew up in the same neighborhood. Laquan was always a smart guy, good at making money. He started dealing weed in high school, then moved on to harder stuff. I wasn't an angel either, but I had my limits. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When I was 20, Laquan got my younger brother Marcus into the drug business. Marcus was a smart kid. He could have gone to college. But Laquan promised him fast money, respect, a cool life. My brother became his courier. In 2001, he was shot during a deal. He was 18. Leroy's voice faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. I blamed Laquan. We had a big fight. I hit him a couple of times, but our friends pulled us apart. A week later, I was arrested for the robbery I served time for. I always suspected Laquan had a hand in it, but I couldn't prove it. And yet, when you got out of prison, you started borrowing money from him? Brooks raised an eyebrow. Not right away. I stayed away from him for the first 2 years. But then, I lost my job at Speedy's auto repair shop when the owner sold the business. Tamika was supporting us on her own with 2 jobs. The bills were piling up. Leroy shook his head. There aren't many options in our neighborhood when you need money fast, especially with my past. Banks won't give me a loan. I don't have any relatives with money. So yeah, I went to Laquan. I took $1,000 at first, then another $1,500. On what terms? 30% a month. It's extortionate, but I had no choice. I got a job at a new workshop and started paying it back little by little. But then my boss held back my wages and we missed a payment. Laquan started threatening to take the car. And without a car, I can't get to work. Brooks nodded understandingly. He had seen this situation hundreds of times. Poverty bred dependence on people like Desmond, and dependence led to despair. And that didn't make you angry enough to, say, deal with the problem once and for all? Leroy looked the detective straight in the eye. It made me angry, of course, but not enough to risk everything. 15 years behind bars taught me to control my anger, detective. I was going to talk to him, try to work out a payment plan, but not kill him. He shook his head. But I never got to him today. I swear. The interrogation continued for another hour. Brooks checked the timeline of events, looking for inconsistencies, but Leroy stood his ground. He hadn't been at Desmond's. He hadn't killed him. When Leroy was taken to a holding cell, Brooks returned to his desk and began reviewing the case file. He called both bars to confirm Leroy's statement. The bartender at Freddy's, Courtney Baker, confirmed that Leroy had indeed been there from around 8 p.m. until closing time at 11 p.m. This posed a problem. If Shankwita had seen Leroy at the victim's house at 11:30 p.m., how could he have been at the bar at the same time? The detective decided to talk to Tamika Griffith again. She was still at the station, waiting in the witness room. Mrs. Griffith, Brooks began, sitting down across from her. I'd like to clarify a few details. You mentioned that you and your husband owed money to Laquan Desmond. Tell me more about that. Tamika nervously fiddled with the strap of her wristwatch. We owed him almost $3,000. $1,500 was the principal. The rest was interest. Laquan came to our house last week and demanded the money back. He threatened to take Leroy's car. How long have you known Laquan? Tamika looked away. A long time. He's lived in our neighborhood his whole life. Everyone knows him. And what was your relationship with him like? Nothing special, just neighbors. Brooks noticed her shoulders tense. Really? Because I find it strange that your husband, who had a serious conflict with Desmond in the past, would go to him to borrow money. Why not someone else? I told you there aren't many options in our neighborhood. Brooks nodded, making a note. Speaking of options, you work 2 jobs, right? At the hair salon and as a night clerk at the motel? Yes, Tamika straightened up. At Stylish Curls during the day and at the Quiet Harbor Motel 3 nights a week. And you still don't have enough money? Have you ever lived in a poor neighborhood, detective? Tamika's voice sounded bitter. Money slips through my fingers. Rent, utilities, car insurance, food, medicine. The list is endless, and the pay is miserable. Brooks nodded understandingly. I know. Believe me. I grew up just a couple of blocks from here. He paused. Mrs. Griffith, can you describe what happened tonight after your husband left? I was at home watching TV, trying to calm down after our argument. Around 9:30, Shanquita called and said she saw Leroy leaving Lakin's house and then found his body. I was in shock. And you immediately thought your husband was responsible? Tamika hesitated. No, I didn't know what to think. But Leroy had threatened to deal with Laquan. Then he left. And then he was seen there at the same time Laquan was killed. Everything pointed to him. I see. Brooks decided to change tactics. How long have you known Shanquita Holloway? 10 years, I guess. She moved to our street around then. And what is your relationship with her? Just neighbors. We exchange pleasantries sometimes, but we're not close. Your husband claims that Ms. Holloway has reasons to wish him ill, something to do with refusing to repair her car. Tamika frowned slightly. Yes, there was that. But it was nothing serious. Shanquita is a little touchy, but not enough to lie about something like that. Brooks made a few more notes, then thanked Tamika and sent her home. Something about this story didn't add up, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, the results of the forensic examination landed on Brooks's desk. He carefully reviewed the report. Time of death: between 8 o'clock and 8:30 p.m. Cause of death: multiple stab wounds to the chest and abdomen. Of particular note is the 6th wound, which penetrated the heart and was inflicted with great force. The nature of the wounds indicates a crime committed in the heat of passion. Brooks rubbed his chin. If Leroy was really at Freddy's bar at 8 p.m., how could he have killed Desmond at the same time? The detective decided to check the surveillance camera footage. At Freddy's, the camera was pointed at the bar. Brooks watched the footage and saw Leroy Griffith enter the bar at 7:55 p.m., 5 minutes earlier than he had stated in his testimony, but that could be attributed to an inaccuracy in the time. The next frame showed Leroy sitting at the bar, talking to the bartender and other patrons, and not leaving the bar until 11 p.m. Damn, Brooks muttered. This completely confirmed Leroy's alibi for the time of the murder. But then, who killed Desmond? And why did Shanquita Holloway claim to have seen Leroy leaving the victim's house? The detective decided to check Shanquita more thoroughly. A database search revealed several administrative violations: petty, disorderly conduct, drunk driving, but nothing serious. However, other information caught his attention. Shanquita Holloway had been charged with giving false testimony in a domestic violence case 5 years ago. She had accused her ex-boyfriend of assault, but later admitted that she had lied out of revenge after they broke up. Brooks decided to visit the crime scene again and talk to the neighbors. Maybe someone else had seen something that night. Laquan Desmond's house was still cordoned off with police tape. Across the street was a modest one-story house where Shanquita Holloway lived. Brooks knocked on the door, but no one answered. Neighbors said she had left early in the morning for her job at the supermarket. The detective decided to look around. Shanquita's house was indeed directly across from the victim's house, and her window had a good view of Desmond's porch. But he noticed one detail. The streetlight across from Desmond's house wasn't working, and the porch was poorly lit in the evening. How could Shanquita have identified Leroy with such certainty in the dark? Brooks knocked on the neighboring houses. An elderly woman in the house to the left of Desmond's said she had seen someone enter his house at around 8 p.m., but couldn't make out who it was. Tall, that's for sure, she said, squinting. Wearing a cap, I think. But I can't say for sure it was Mr. Griffith. All young people look the same these days. Brooks noted that Leroy and Laquan were about the same height and build, another detail that made identification difficult in the dark. Back at the station, the detective decided to check the connections between everyone involved in the incident. He requested details of phone calls made by Laquan Desmond, Leroy, Tamika Griffith, and Shanquita Holloway over the past month. The results were interesting. There had been numerous calls between Tamika and Laquan over the past few weeks, some of them quite long and at odd times, late at night or early in the morning. Even more suspicious were several short calls between Tamika and Shanquita, immediately before and after the time of the murder. All of this made Brooks think. He reviewed Tamika's statement again. She claimed that she learned about the murder from Shanquita, who called her around 9:30 p.m. But according to the records, Tamika called Shanquita at 9:15 p.m. And then Shanquita called her back at 9:40 p.m., right after the alleged time of the murder. To better understand the chronology of events, Brooks drew up a timeline. 7:30 p.m. Leroy leaves home after an argument with Tamika. 7:55 p.m. Leroy enters Freddy's bar, which is recorded on camera 20:00 to 20:30, approximating time of Laquan Desmond's murder. 20:15, Tamika calls Shanquita. 8:40 p.m. Shanquita calls Tamika. 8:30 p.m. Shanquita calls 911 to report the discovery of the body. Something didn't add up. If Shanquita didn't discover the body until 8:30 p.m., what was she talking about with Tamika at 8:40 p.m.? And why did Tamika call her at 20:15 right during the murder? Brooks decided to dig deeper. He requested the financial records of Tamika Griffith and the Quiet Harbor Motel, where she worked as a night clerk. The results were even more interesting. Over the past 3 months, Tamika had handled much more money than her salary should have allowed. In addition, there had been 2 cash shortages at the motel during Tamika's shifts, but no official charges had been filed. The picture was slowly but surely beginning to take shape. Brooks decided to take action. He called Shanquita Holloway in for another interview. She arrived at the station nervous, constantly glancing at her watch. "I'm late for work, Detective. The sooner we finish, the better." "It won't take long, Ms. Holloway," Brooks reassured her. "I just want to clarify some details of your story. You claim that you saw Leroy Griffith leaving Laquan Desmond's house at around 11:30, is that correct?" "Yes, absolutely," Shanquita nodded. "And you're sure it was him?" "Of course. I told you I recognized him by his build, his gait, and his Detroit Lions cap." "Ms. Holloway, you do realize that giving false testimony is a serious crime?" Shanquita tensed. "What do you mean?" "We have surveillance footage from Freddy's bar showing that Leroy Griffith was there from 5 minutes past 8 until 11 o'clock that evening. He couldn't have been at Desmond's house at the time you mentioned." Shanquita's eyes widened, and she began nervously fingering her purse. I could have gotten the time wrong. Maybe it was earlier." "And here's another interesting point," Brooks continued, ignoring her attempts to wriggle out of it. "You claim that you found Desmond's body around 9:30 and immediately called Tamika Griffith, and then the police. But according to the call records, you spoke with Tamika at 8:40, almost an hour before your call at 9:01. What did you talk about?" Shanquita turned pale. Her hands began to shake noticeably. It was a mistake. I don't remember exactly." "Ms. Holloway," Brooks's voice became harsher, "we also have information about your financial difficulties. You owe money to almost everyone in the neighborhood, including Laquan Desmond. But strangely, this morning, a round sum of $500 was deposited into your account. Where did this money come from?" Shanquita jumped up. "I don't have to answer those questions. I need a lawyer." Brooks nodded. "Of course, that's your right. But let me suggest what happened. Tamika Griffith asked you to give false testimony against her husband and paid you for it. She knew about your animosity toward Leroy and your financial problems. Now the key question is, why did Tamika want to frame her husband so badly?" Shanquita remained silent, but it was clear from her expression that Brooks had hit a nerve. After questioning Shanquita, the detective decided to talk to Tamika Griffith again. But when he tried to contact her, her phone was off and she wasn't home. Just in case, Brooks sent a patrol car to the Quiet Harbor Motel where she was supposed to be working the night shift. An hour later, the patrol called back. "Detective, Mrs. Griffith didn't show up for work. The manager says she called in sick, and there's something else interesting. According to the staff, Laquan Desmond was a frequent guest at this motel, always during Tamika Griffith's shift." Brooks thanked the officer and thought about it. The picture was becoming clearer. Tamika and Laquan seemed to have had some kind of relationship that Leroy didn't know about. But what exactly happened on the night of the murder? The detective returned to the case files. He carefully studied the medical examiner's report again. One detail caught his attention. The nature of the wounds indicates a crime committed in the heat of passion. The size and depth of the knife wounds suggest that the attacker was probably not very physically strong, but acted with extreme emotional intensity. Not very physically strong. That didn't sound like Leroy, a strong man who worked as a mechanic. But Tamika, Brooks continued reading. Traces of lipstick were found on the victim's neck and fingernail marks on his back, indicating recent intimate contact, presumably a couple of hours before his death. Ezekiel Brooks sat at his desk with all the case files spread out in front of him. He methodically analyzed the available facts, trying to see the whole picture. The medical examiner's report clearly indicated an intimate relationship between Laquan Desmond and a woman shortly before his death. The phone records showed frequent and lengthy calls between Tamika and the victim. But Brooks was too experienced a detective to jump to conclusions. He needed more solid evidence. First, he decided to talk to the staff at the Quiet Harbor Motel where Tamika worked. The manager, a plump, middle-aged woman with a tired look, immediately recognized Laquan's photo. "Oh yes, Mr. Desmond was here regularly. He always booked the same room, number 23, and always during Tamika's shift." "Did he stay alone?" Brooks asked. The manager raised her eyebrows meaningfully. "If you're asking if Tamika was with him, I can't confirm that officially. But we have a 20-minute break between shifts when no one is at the front desk." "And how long did this go on?" 8 months, I think. It started shortly after Tamika started working here. You know, I don't judge. Life is hard, and Desmond was generous to those he liked." The woman lowered her voice. "Once I saw him give her an envelope, I think it was money. More than her weekly pay." With this information, Brooks requested the motel's surveillance footage for the past month. A clear pattern emerged. Laquan Desmond came to the motel 3 times a week, always during Tamika's shift, and always for a short time, between 20 minutes and an hour. "A secret romance?" suggested Brooks's assistant, a young officer named Jackson. "Possibly. Or something more complicated," Brooks said thoughtfully. "We need to find out if Leroy Griffith knew about this." Brooks returned to the cell where Leroy was being held. He looked exhausted but was holding his ground. "Mr. Griffith, I have a few more questions for you. Did you know that your wife and Laquan Desmond had a special relationship?" Leroy looked up at the detective wearily. "What are you talking about? We have evidence that they regularly met at the motel where your wife works. Did you know about this?" A shadow crossed Leroy's face, but he quickly regained his composure. "No, I didn't know, but I can't say I'm surprised. Tamika had been distant for the last few months. I put it down to her working 2 jobs. Leroy paused. "Even if they did have something, that doesn't make me a murderer, detective." "I know," Brooks nodded. "In fact, you have a solid alibi for the time of the murder. The security footage from Freddy's bar confirms that you were there from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. The murder took place between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. Leroy's eyes widened. "You mean—" "I'm not saying anything, Mr. Griffith. We're just gathering facts." Brooks stood up. "But I want you to know that I intend to get to the bottom of this, no matter who the real killer is." Leaving the room, the detective gave orders to check Tamika's alibi for the time of the murder. A preliminary investigation revealed that she had taken the evening off from her job at the motel, citing a headache. The next step was to revisit the crime scene. Brooks carefully examined Desmond's house, paying attention to details that might have been overlooked the first time around. In the bedroom on the bedside table, he noticed a small box. Inside were several photographs and a flash drive. The photos showed Tamika and Laquan in compromising positions. The flash drive contained videos of their encounters, as well as CCTV footage from the motel showing Tamika taking money from the cash register. Blackmail, Brooks muttered. Now a motive was beginning to emerge. Perhaps Desmond had used this material to control Tamika, or threatened to show it to Leroy. The detective decided to return to Shankwhite Holloway. This time, he found her at home. When she saw Brooks, she tried to close the door, but he was persistent. "Miss Holloway, I need to ask you some very important questions, and this time, I advise you to tell the truth." Shankwhite reluctantly let him in. Her small living room was cramped and stuffy. "Miss Holloway, we have irrefutable proof that Leroy Griffith could not have been the killer. At the time of Laquan Desmond's death, he was at Freddy's bar, as confirmed by video footage. Now tell me, who asked you to give false testimony?" Shankwhite lowered her head. Her long, false nails tapped nervously on the armrest of the chair. "I didn't want to get involved," she finally said. "It was all Tamika. She called me that evening and said she was having problems with Laquan. She asked me to come to his house. And what happened next? When I got there, Laquan was already dead." Shankwhite's voice trembled. Tamika was standing over him with a knife in her hand, covered in blood. She was hysterical, repeating that he had threatened her, blackmailed her, that he wanted to tell Leroy everything. Shankwhite took a deep breath. "Tamika is my childhood friend. We grew up together. I couldn't abandon her in that situation." "So you agreed to frame her husband?" "She offered me money, $500. I have debts, detective. And besides, Leroy isn't the nicest person in the world. He refused to repair my car when I was in a desperate situation." Shankwhite paused. "I know I did the wrong thing, but I felt like I had no choice." "What happened to the murder weapon and Tamika's clothes?" "She gave me a bag with her things. She told me to throw them away from the house. I buried them in the park behind the playground, under a big oak tree." Brooks nodded and took out a pair of handcuffs. "Shankwhite Holloway, you are under arrest for accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent." While one of the officers was processing Shankwhite's arrest, Brooks sent a team to search for the bag of evidence. At the same time, a warrant was issued for Tamika Griffith's arrest on suspicion of murder. But when the police arrived at her home address, the house was empty. Tamika had disappeared. Brooks organized a search. All bus and train stations and airports were alerted. Patrol cars combed the area. Tamika's phone was turned off, but technicians were working to determine its last location. During the investigation, another important detail came to light. It turned out that Laquan Desmond had not only blackmailed Tamika, but also threatened to ruin her life. Text messages were found on his phone in which he demanded more money and favors from her, threatening not only to tell Leroy everything, but also to hand over the recording of the theft to the police. The bag with Tamika's blood-stained clothes was found exactly where Shankwhite had indicated. Forensic examination quickly confirmed that the blood belonged to the victim. Tamika's fingerprints were found on the knife handle. By evening, information about the fugitive's whereabouts had been received. Her phone signal was detected near a bus station in a neighboring town. Brooks personally led the arrest team. Tamika was found in a small motel not far from the station. She did not resist arrest and appeared resigned and devastated. At the police station in the interrogation room, Tamika Griffith confessed everything. "It started as a business relationship," she said wearily. "Laquan offered me extra money for the use of his motel room for his meetings. Then he started coming alone, showing interest." She lowered her head. I was weak. Leroy changed after prison, became withdrawn and distant, and Laquan was generous, attentive. Tamika recounted how Desmond gradually began to manipulate her, forcing her to steal money from the motel cash register. He recorded everything. He said it was his insurance. When I wanted to end the relationship, he threatened to ruin my life. Her voice trembled. That evening, after Leroy left, Laquan called and said that if I didn't come to him, he would tell my husband everything and turn me into the police. I went, tried to talk some sense into him. We got into a fight. He hit me, said I was his property. Tamika sighed. I didn't plan to kill him. I just grabbed a knife from the table, wanted to scare him, but he laughed in my face, said people like me were too cowardly. Something inside me broke. After Tamika was questioned and formally charged, Brooks returned to Leroy Griffith. All charges against him were dropped. The man sat in the waiting room, looking devastated but strangely calm. Tamika confessed to the murder of Laquan Desmond. Brooks told him. She also told us about their relationship and how he blackmailed her. Leroy nodded. I had a feeling something was going on. She's been different these last few months, nervous, distant. She cried a lot at night. I thought it was because she was tired working 2 jobs. He shook his head. I should have known there was more to it. She was afraid to tell you, Brooks remarked, afraid of your reaction because of your history with Desmond. I wouldn't judge her. Leroy looked out the window. 15 years behind bars changes a person, detective. I've learned to forgive. If she had come to me, told me about the blackmail, we would have found a way out. He sighed. You know, the strangest thing is, I still love her, despite everything. You'll be able to visit her, Brooks said, but first she has to go to trial. I know how it works. Leroy nodded. Better than most. It was late in the evening when Detective Ezekiel Brooks finished his report on the murder of Laquan Desmond. All the evidence pointed to Tamika Griffith. The prosecutor considered the case clear-cut. Murder in the heat of passion. Given the circumstances and her lack of a criminal record, Tamika would likely get 10 to 15 years. But before sending the papers, Brooks decided to pay Leroy another visit. He found the man outside the Griffiths' house, packing his belongings into an old worn suitcase. Leaving? Brooks asked. Too many memories, Leroy replied. A friend offered me a job in Cleveland. I think a change of scenery will do me good. What about Tamika? Leroy froze. I'll write her a letter. I'll explain. Maybe I'll visit her when the wound has healed a little. But now, he shook his head. Right now, I need to learn how to live again. Alone. Brooks nodded, understandingly. You know, at the beginning of this case, I was convinced you were guilty. All the evidence pointed to you. That's usually the case with people like me, Leroy said with a bitter smile. A black man with a criminal record. An easy target. I'm glad I was wrong, Brooks admitted honestly. And I hope you find your way, Mr. Griffith. Thank you, Detective. Leroy held out his hand, for not stopping at the obvious and finding the truth. They shook hands. Brooks drove away with a sense of accomplishment. Justice had prevailed, though tragedy could not be avoided. Leroy and Tamika's story was the story of many in their neighborhood, a story of people driven into a corner by poverty, past mistakes, and despair. As he drove away from the east side, Brooks glanced one last time in the rearview mirror. Leroy Griffith stood on the porch of his house, a small figure against the backdrop of the old building. A man who was about to start his life with a clean slate, leaving behind 15 years in prison and a wife who had committed murder. At the police station, Brooks closed the case file, signed it, and stamped it. Justice had been served, but that didn't make anyone feel any better. Such was the harsh reality of his job. Even when the truth came out, it rarely brought comfort. The lives of everyone involved in this drama had been irrevocably changed. One man was dead, another was in prison, and a third was left alone with his demons. Detective Ezekiel Brooks knew that tomorrow there would be a new case on his desk, New victims, new suspects. The cycle of crime and punishment never stopped in neighborhoods like the East Side. All he could do was try to do his job honestly, without giving in to prejudice or taking the path of least resistance. As he was leaving for home, Brooks glanced once more at the photos from the case. Leroy and Tamika in an old family photo, smiling, full of hope. Who could have predicted that their lives would turn out so tragically? A random chain of events, wrong decisions, unspoken feelings, and this was the result. 3 human lives destroyed, and it all started with a simple phrase, "I'm going out for cigarettes."